So, hello and welcome, Professor Comrade Bruno Drweski. And today we will speak about the history of Europe, history of the Third International Communist, Comintern, and about very complicated subject, how reacted the communists to the rise of fascism in Europe.
Yes, so of course, when we talk about fascism, we talk first about Italian fascism, and it creates sometimes misunderstandings since, scientifically speaking, fascism is an Italian movement. And politically, it was the word fascism was taken by communists as a word extended to other countries, and especially to Germany and to what was called later Nazism. And that's a problem because, of course, from the scientific point of view, we can see Italian fascism as a movement which is quite different from what happened in other countries, and especially in Germany. But from the political point of view, we can see so many common elements between Italian fascism and other form of, let's say, totalitarian, authoritarian, nationalistic movement, especially Nazism, that even if Nazism became much stronger than Italian fascism later, we can consider that Nazism belongs to the same political wave or ideological wave as fascism, even if, as we know, for example, Italian fascism was not basically anti-Semitic as when German Nazism was based, ideologically speaking, on anti-Semitism, but maybe, and that's another important issue, maybe is anti-Semitism is not the most important aspect of fascism, and especially of Nazism, in spite of the fact, of course, that Hitler killed millions of Jews and realized a radically anti-Semitic program. So that's one thing. Second aspect of things is that Italian fascism began around a political leader, Mussolini, who came from the socialist movement. Of course, he cut his ties with socialism during the First World War, but anyway, his roots are in the left from the very beginning, and later things became clearer. But of course, at the very beginning, even Lenin wrote about that. At the very beginning, Mussolini could appear as somebody who had leftist roots, which is not the case of Hitler, of course, in Germany, and that's the basic difference. So when we talk about fascism, we talk first of all about the first wave of authoritarian movement, the Italian one, and that's a very important point. But in the same time, Italy was not a central country for imperialism. We can say Italy was a weak imperialist country and was not very, very important in the European inside European imperialism, and that's why when we think about fascism, we think mostly about what happened later in Germany, and that's very important. And we can say that from the very beginning of the German Nazism, situation became very tense, and not only on the local level, on the German level, but on the European and world level. Because we can say that Italian fascism had some influence outside Italy, but basically it didn't change the mentalities, the understanding of the situation all over the world. As soon as in Germany Nazism became an important movement, even before Hitler conquered power, we can say fascism became a world movement, and had an important, was very important for the whole world. And of course, and then we have to understand that why and it's coming from Germany, the fact that we call fascism all these movements beginning from Italy up to Germany, because when Nazism began in Germany, the German left, the communists especially, but not only communists, the German left observed the birth of this movement in Germany as a repetition of what happened in Italy. And to a large extent, they were right, but they couldn't, of course, imagine that Hitler would be so successful as he began to be, because we have to take into account the fact that up to 1933, German left, and especially German communists, were quite optimistic. In fact, they were convinced that the revolution, the socialist revolution, will happen earlier or later, but anyway will happen, and that fascism in Italy and the brand of fascism developing in Germany, the Nazism, was just a bad moment, I would say, in the history toward revolution. And we have to take that into account, because if we do not take that into account, we don't understand how what happened in Germany in 1933 was a big surprise, and changed basically the situation. And what I'm telling about is important, because I would say, and it's very interesting also, that the German communists were not so aware of what is fascism, comparing, for example, to Soviet communists. I would say Soviet Union, Soviet leader, Soviet party was much more aware what is coming from German fascism, it means Nazism, than Germans, who were convinced that earlier or later there will be a German revolution, and that fascism and Nazism and Hitler are just a bad moment that will not last long. In fact, it didn't last long, because it lasted only 12 years. But of course, these 12 years were very important in the history of humankind, and were not so unimportant as it was considered, let's say, before Hitler get to power. So that's one thing important. The second thing we have to take into account is that, coming back to Italian fascism, at the very beginning of fascist government in Italy, quite a large part of left in the world, and I'm not talking only of communists in different countries, but I'm talking also of social democrats in different countries, couldn't really place, I would say, Mussolini on the political map, and that for a certain time, there was some illusion about the fact that the fascist regime in Italy could go in a rather left-wing direction and not in a right-wing direction. Of course, later this illusion disappeared, but at the very beginning it was the case. It was even later the case with Hitler, because if we look, for example, at people like Léon Blum in France, one of the main socialist leaders, and it's very important because we have to take into account that Blum was from Jewish origin, so we can suppose that he would be strongly anti-Nazi. And when Hitler get to power in 1933, we have article from him considering that, you know, Hitlerism and Nazism can change in a rather good direction. It's possible to imagine that Hitler Germany will go toward rather a left-wing movement, that all this ultra-nationalistic, racist, anti-Semitic ideology, it's just a provisional, let's say, propaganda tool for Hitler. But basically, they were not all sure that Nazism was so bad as it happened to be. And this we have also to take into account, considering Germany and German left, because if we take into account one fact, which is basic to understand what happened at the beginning of the 30s in Germany, the basic fact that the German Revolution in 1918 and 1919 was defeated by Social Democrats, not by the ultra right wing. I mean, basically, the German government at the end of the First World War was a social democratic government. And this government created what was called in German the Freikorps, or the volunteers, who destroyed German Spartakism and German communists. And so we have to think about that, because there was blood between communists and socialists or social democrats, and this blood was organized by social democrats and was and they created the tools that made Nazism possible, because of course the Freikorps, the volunteer, were right-wing people who were at the base of the creation of the future SA militias of the Nazi party, because there is I would say a direct link between Freikorps and future Sturmabteilung, SA mass militia of the Nazi party. But this creation was at the very beginning the result of a decision taken by a social democratic government. So that's the reason why, and we have to understand it. That's the reason why in the 20s, communists were calling social democrats social fascists, since they studied what happened in Italy, and they concluded from that in Germany there is a situation which is quite similar. It means Mussolini came from socialist movement, and little by little became more and more right-wing as he arrived to the point of creating an extreme right movement, which is fascism in Italy, and that to a certain extent That's what happened in Germany. Just that the order of things, the chronology of things was different. It means in Italy we had an Italian socialist who little by little went on the right, toward the right. In Germany we had a left which used right-wing movements to stay at power, but basically it's more or less the same situation, even if the chronology of events are slightly different between Italy and Germany. And that's a very important reason to understand why it was very difficult at the beginning of the 30s for communists and socialists to take the same side and defend, let's say, liberal democracy in Germany, because for the communists, the social democrats were responsible for the development, for the birth and the development of Nazi militias. And not only in theory, but in practice, because these militias crushed communist Spartakists in a bloody civil war, or something which can be compared to a civil war. So you cannot forget in 1 year all that. It has to take time. Of course, we can say that German left, it means the communists on one side and the social democrats on the other side, didn't understand let's say, the force of Nazism, because in fact, social democrats were never Nazis. Social democrats used people who developed in the direction of Nazism, but they thought it was not very important. They thought that those people are not very have no real political program, and they cannot be a great danger for German democracy. So we can use them against communists. And the communists on the other side considered more or less the same thing, that fascist ideology and Nazi ideology is not really serious, which is the case. I mean, scientifically speaking, the Nazi ideology has no real rational base. That's obvious, but that's not the reason why this ideology cannot be powerful, and it happened to be powerful. And the communists also thought that Nazism is not a serious movement. It exploits some, let's say, prejudice existing within the society, but it's not really serious. So they cannot be a great danger, and the main danger is the social democrats, which are using fascists, social fascism as they called it, to eliminate communists. And basically they are the main danger for German democracy and for German future people's democracy. And we have to understand that, because if we don't understand that, we do not understand history. I mean, we know now what Nazism and Hitlerism means, ideologically speaking, politically speaking, and we know that a mass movement like that is completely irrational, but is can be very powerful, and that such a regime will not collapse in a couple of days. And that's the basic difference with Italy, because in Italy, of course, the fascist regime didn't collapse, but, well, let's say from the Northern European point of view, we could quite easily consider that Mediterranean nations, Mediterranean states, Mediterranean societies are backward societies, which stand all the time to different forms of, let's say, authoritarian government, because it's not only the case of fascist Italy, but we had the same tendencies in Spain, in Portugal, in the Balkans, or like we had in Latin America. And, it was not very clear that Italian fascism is something quite different, basically different from, let's say, traditional authoritarian, more or less military regime we had in backward and peripheral countries of the capitalist world. As soon as Nazism developed in Germany, inside a very developed country, because of what I said, it was quite easy to think it's not a really serious movement. In such a country like Germany, stupid people like Hitler will not last long. So either they are used by social democrats to promote anti-communist government and to give to the social democrat the monopoly of so-called left, either they will collapse more or less because they are not able to control a, let's say, so serious country as Germany. So there was a misunderstanding about that. And it created the problem that communists and social democrats couldn't cooperate up to late against German fascism or Nazism, and that's a quite important point, taking into account what I already said, that there was blood between social democrats and communists, and this blood came from right-wing militias, but right-wing militias created by the social, or under the dominance of social democratic government, and that we have to take into account. Second thing is maybe a lack of understanding, and when I'm talking about that, I don't criticize them, because we know that in history we understand very well what happened, but it's very difficult to understand what is happening now. I mean, we cannot judge the error that were made in the 20s as if we would understand the nowadays situation. Nowadays situation, we have quite a lot of problem to understand it in a rational way. So we have to understand that it was the same thing in the 20s. The German left was misunderstanding quite a lot of aspects of the situation at the time, even if they mobilized and they were rationally analyzing quite a lot of aspects of Hitlerism and Nazism, but still they misunderstood the strength of Nazism, even if they understood the class aspect of the situation. And that's another point I would like to talk about, is that Nazism is a movement which is possible. Nazism and fascism is a movement which is really possible only in strong imperialist countries. We find fascists all over the world, of course, but basically victorious fascism can happen only in countries where they have the financial support of an imperialist bourgeoisie, which has money to pay them, to feed them, and to let them develop when the democracy is beginning to be not useful for the dominant for the leading classes. But in the same time, if we look superficially at, and as it was done in the 20s, at Nazism, we can consider that in spite of the fact that they cannot come to power without the financial and, of course, political help of the big imperialist bourgeoisie, they develop in social classes which are not the higher bourgeoisie, but they develop in, let's say, lower classes or middle classes. But and this creates some misunderstanding that can be analyzed, but of course it takes some time and it cannot be done overnight, and it couldn't be done overnight. Now, if we look basically at what happened in Germany, we can find that Nazi Party was never a party of the working class. In this sense, that during the whole 20s and 30s up to 1933, the big industrial working class of big cities was strongly linked with Left Party. At the beginning, rather with Social Democrats, at the end, rather with communists. The communists were developing. But basically, if we analyze, for example, election in Germany in the 20s and 30s, we see that the working class bloc of electors is always the same. It means that the big industrial workers from big cities take side of with Social Democrats or communists, but never went on the side of Nazi Party. Nazi Party was a party that developed rather in countryside, little cities, and when they managed to conquer some element of the working class, it was only of the workers, it was only in little cities and in little industries, but never in the big industry. That's for sure. And big German cities like Berlin, like Hamburg, were never pro-Nazi up to the very end, up to the Hitler dictatorship. But of course, the basic, we have two basic elements that was the base of the mass movement of Nazism. It means on one side, what I already told about earlier, the lumpen proletariat, which is, as we know, a social class, a lower social class, but still a class without class consciousness. And this element were very strongly represented inside the Freikorps I told earlier about, and later among the SA, the Sturmabteilung of the Nazi Party. This element, this Lumpenproletariat, was a very important element for the mobilization of Nazi Party troops. And they created the atmosphere, the terror atmosphere, that allowed Nazis step by step to conquer little towns, little regions, peripheral region of Germany, but of course not the main cities. On the other side, the second pillar of Nazism was more or less what we can call the petit bourgeoisie, which is a concept, a complicated, let's say, concept, because we had let's say, the traditional petit bourgeoisie of little shopkeepers, etc., and they were quite well represented among Nazi Party membership. But we had also let's say, the middle classes, which were not at the very beginning really linked with the Nazi movement, but who became to change their mind in the direction of the Nazi movement when the economical crisis of 1929 happened. And it's very important to understand that, because if we look at the election in Germany at that time, and it's very important also to understand the situation nowadays with the comeback of extreme right, because even if it's very different, but still there are some signs we have to take into account to understand the nowadays situation. Because at the beginning of the 20s, let's say the middle classes, it means all professionals, intellectuals, university teachers, local teachers, shopkeepers, advocates, and all these middle classes were rather hesitating when they were going to election to vote for the center left, which was in Germany called the DDP, Deutsche Demokratische Partei, which was the Democratic Party of Germany, which was center left, or DVP, Deutsche Volkspartei, which was rather center right. But it's very important to take into account that they were centrists. And these parties almost disappeared from the political spectrum of Germany after the crisis of 1929. And the centrist electorate went to the far right, to the extreme right. That's very important to take into account, because we can be surprised by that, since the right-wing movement in Germany, the nationalist conservative party in Germany was the DNVP, Deutsche National Volkspartei. It means the German National People's Party, which was the traditional right-wing party. The Nationalist Party, a party which was rather linked with the ideology of the former German Empire, of the former monarchy, and so on. And this party didn't disappear. The right-wing electorate in Germany didn't went to the Nazi party. It's the center electorate that went to the Nazi party. And it's very important, because with that we have to understand that middle classes, so-called middle class, of course middle class is a myth, but since it is a myth, people believe in myths. And as soon as they believe that they are middle class, they are quite naturally, politically speaking, on the center. They think it's not very good to be on the so-called extreme, and they prefer to be center. But as soon as capitalism fall in crisis, these people see their situation very diminishing. They look at the lower classes as the not only the enemy, but they look at the lower classes as the classes they don't want to join, because they are supposed to be higher and they don't want to come back. So their behavior then put them on the extreme right. And fascism is a trend which doesn't come from the right wing. It comes from the center. And the destabilized center become very easily extreme right. And this happened in a crystal clear way in Germany at the end of the 20s, beginning of the 30s. And it's very important to understand because it's a situation we are facing now. When the middle classes are impoverished, when the middle classes are precarized, when the middle classes are panicked, they tend to go on the extreme right. And the so-called Democrats or the so-called liberals, in the American sense of the word liberal, can be much more easily fascist than the right-wing conservative people, who stay more or less on the trend they were supporting. That's one aspect which is very important. Another aspect which is important and which Marxists have the difficulty to cope with is the religious aspect, because for a lot of reasons, religious questions are difficult to analyze by Marxists, and I think that's one of the aspects that had to be taken into account for the future. But anyway, we have to take that into account in the German situation because it's very, very interesting, considering the evolution of the Nazi Party. First of all, the Nazi Party began to develop in southern Germany, which is a Catholic Germany, and quite a lot. And I would say at the beginning, at least, of the majority of the Nazi leaders were coming from Catholic Germany or even Austria, but which was, of course, also a Catholic country. And that's very important. But much more important is the fact of what happened later. It means that if the leaders of the Nazi Party were coming from the, let's say, a Catholic, hierarchized, rigid Germany, the masses didn't really went behind them. The Catholic masses in Germany voted rather for the so-called Zentrum, which was the Catholic Party of Germany, and they voted for that party up to the very end. But what changed at the end of the 20s is the fact that the Protestant Germany became to vote much more massively than Catholic Germany to a Nazi Party. So if we look at the situation from the point of view of elite, political elite, we can say that the Nazi Party was rather a Catholic based party. But if we look at the electorate, then we observe that the Nazi Party was rather a Protestant party, since maybe, and it's a hypothesis, when you are a Catholic, I'm talking about basic Catholic, you are belonging to a structure, to a church, which is not national, which is international. And, the head of the Catholicism is in Rome, and he's not German. So you don't belong to a political structure which is German-based. And that's the basic difference with Protestantism, because, of course, Protestantism is very different. But basically, Protestantism in Germany is a national religion. It's a religion which happened in Germany under Luther, and Luther was the founder of the German literary language, because his traduction of the Bible created the modern German language, the normalized, let's say, German language. And the national aspect of Lutheranism was always quite important for the legitimacy of Protestantism and Lutheranism in Germany. So if the Catholic masses were accustomed to belong to a structure which was not strictly German, the Protestants were belonging to a structure, a much more democratic structure, by the way, but still a structure which was basically much more national, much more German. And that's quite important to understand, because basically we people of the left are accustomed to think that Protestantism is more progressive than Catholicism. And to a large extent, that's true. But still, history can put ahead strange things. And to a certain extent, we have to understand that Protestantism is not always progressive, and that sometimes Catholicism can be a tool which is not anti-Nazi, but which still, let's say, repel to a certain extent the development of a mass movement like Nazism. So it's an interesting issue, and I would say it's an issue we in the left, inside Marxist movement, didn't really think about, and it's an error, because as we saw in Europe, but as we see in the whole world, religious questions happen to be much more important than we were supposing 100 years ago. And we have to take that into account, because Marxists are supposed to analyze the objective reality, and the objective reality is that religious issues are much more important than we could suppose 100 years ago. And on that point, we can say that German Nazism is a very interesting social experiment. Of course, a very tragic one, a very murderous one, but a very interesting one. To understand the complexity of a society, the issue of the German Revolution in 1918, the split between social democrats and communists, the creation of the Freikorps and later the Nazi Party, the difference between working class of big cities and working people outside big cities, the difference between Lumpenproletariat, petit bourgeoisie, middle classes and working class, the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, and a lot of other things, but I mentioned that ones, are all very important to understand what is fascism, what was fascism then, what was Nazism then. But to a certain extent, it's very important to analyze that if we want to understand what is the behavior of so-called middle classes. And I would say that the nowadays capitalists, they are genius. They are real genius. I mean, they are our enemies, but they are really genius, because they destroyed, at least in Western countries, the big factories and the big working class concentrations, pushing most of the workers sometimes toward unemployment, but most of the time toward what we call the precariat. They changed working class mass concentrated people in some things which is, let's say, subjectively creating a petit bourgeois mentality. A Uber taxi driver objectively is an overexploited worker, but in fact he believes that he is the master of his taxi, and he thinks in a petit bourgeois way. And that's the genius of capitalism now, is that it created a lot of people which will rather easily evolve toward a new form of fascism, rather toward a new form of radical leftism or communism or Marxism. And we have to take that into account, because capitalists did understand that Hitler succeeded. In fact, he succeeded. Of course, Nazi Germany didn't succeed, but as an imperialist power. But Nazism succeeded as an example how you can take control of a country where the working class is very well organized, how you can divide this class in two, and how you can use lower classes, disintegrated lower classes, against the integrated lower classes, which is the working class. And on that point, we can say that we live in a new fascist society now, because in another form, of course, of development, but anyway, to a large extent, they managed to destroy, at least in the Western countries, in Europe, in North America, the concentrated working class, taking into account the example of what Hitler managed to realize. It means the division of working classes. And I think it's very important. And if we look at the evolution of what so-called is public opinion now, we see that the right-wing trends and the extreme right-wing trends are developing in a lot of countries, in France, in Germany, in United States, in Italy, in Greece, and etc., etc., etc. And we are coming back to the situation of the Germany of the 20s and 30s. It means the middle classes, impoverished middle classes, are very dangerous, not only for socialism, but even for democracy, because they can be very easily oriented toward extreme right. And that's important. I think that's why we have to study the Hitler time up till now, and in a very, very, very profound way. Yeah, okay, more or less. Maybe you have questions. It would be easier now if you ask me questions.
Bruno, but you didn't say about the international communist politics. Yes, because I thought that it was the subject, because in the Trotsky's propaganda, one of the attack against the Stalin and Soviet Union after when Trotsky was expelled from Soviet Union is that because of bad politic of international communists, because of Stalin, who was a leader of Soviet Union, and international communists are listening to Stalin, because of that, there was a lot of mistakes, and the fascism in Europe are growing and take country after one country after another. So do you think?
I understand, but I concentrated on Germany, and I think it's very important to concentrate on Germany, because we have this, to a certain extent, illusion that the Comintern was Soviet-based, and because it was Soviet-based, it was the decision of Soviet Union, Soviet leadership, and especially Stalin, that explains all the policy of Comintern. To a certain extent, of course, it is right, because when, let's say, Soviet state interests, strictly Soviet state interests, were let's say, were under pressure, of course, the Comintern took side of Soviet state interests in all questions, that could then appear. But that's one aspect of the thing. The second aspect of the thing we have to take into account is that whatever was the force of the Soviet leadership and the Soviet Union, and the influence of Soviet Union on the decisions of Comintern, we have to take into account that Bolsheviks and Soviet communists were from the very beginning under the influence, I would say, of the, let's say, German school. Why? Because, of course, the German Marxists were the center of Marxism, at least up to the Russian Revolution, but I would say later on. For example, that's of course anecdotal, but still we have to think about that. The language, the official language of the Comintern was not Russian, it was German. The whole Comintern up to 1943 functioned in German. The German was the language of the Communist International, not Russian, for basic reasons. And for historical reasons, but it's not, it's not unimportant, the language you speak, because when you speak a language, it means that you are inside this cultural circle. It's always much more easy to read articles coming from that linguistic circle. So the whole leadership of the Comintern was using German, was thinking in German, was informed by German language press and by German literature. Up to the very end of the Comintern. So that's very important. And that's a cultural reason why we cannot consider that the German communists were secondary inside the Comintern. They were much more strong, much more, they influenced much more than, let's say, the French communists, the Italian communists, the American communists, or the Chinese communists, because, the Comintern was talking in their language. So that's one aspect, and it is important to understand, because if we do not understand that, we do not understand the cultural hegemony of German culture inside the Comintern till the end of the Comintern. And the cultural hegemony of German communists were explained quite a lot of things, and that's the reason why maybe I concentrated on the situation of Germany, because of course German communists inside the Comintern were working and were pushing, I would say, their point of views much more easily than other communists, including Soviet or Russian communists. That's first thing. Second thing we have to take into account, and it's the consequence of what I say more or less, is that we have to take into account, you know it very well, that let's say East European countries, East European societies, and the Russian one is no exception, has quite a lot of, let's say, inferiority feeling toward the West, and that this situation happens to be real everywhere, including inside the communist movement. So a Russian communist will look in the 20s in another way toward German communists than he's looking at other, let's say, Eastern European communists and so on, because for psychological reasons, for cultural reason, and etc. And this is, of course, very important. Soviet Union paid the Comintern, that's for sure. Soviet Union had the political tool to impose its choices on the Comintern. That's very important. But culturally speaking, in a broad sense of culture, the German communists were much stronger than the Soviet communists inside the Comintern, and it's of course very difficult to measure that, but we have to take that into account. So the way the communists in Germany evolved in the 20s, in the 30s, the way they looked at social democrats inspired quite a lot of the decision of the Comintern, including Stalin's decision. I mean, Stalin was not, the vision of anti-Stalinists are caricatural. We can, of course, think what we want about Stalin, but the way the legend of Stalin was built, the black legend of Stalin, but the legend of Stalin basically, that Stalin was a man deciding by himself, not taking into account nothing, and just deciding one day something and the second day took a contrary decision. It's completely stupid and I would say childish to look that way. Stalin was a man belonging to a group of people leading a very important country, and he had to take decision taking into account a lot of factors, a lot of issues. And concerning the policy of Comintern, Stalin was always quite oriented toward, let's say, German culture. For example, before he took power in Soviet Union, if we look at the nationality policy of Soviet Union, that was carried on by Stalin, since, as we know, from the very beginning of the revolution, he was the man dedicated to nationality question. We have to take into account that Stalin developed his way of thinking on nationality question before the revolution, when he was in Poland, in Poronin, and when he studied what he studied. He studied Austro-Marxism, because Austro-Marxists were very, very specialized in national issues, since the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as you know, was an empire of a multinational empire, and that's logical that the Austrian Marxists couldn't think about politics not taking into account the nationality questions, and they based their point of view on what is called the German school. The German universities were developing a view of national questions, of national issues from the end of the 19th century. That, of course, created an ethnical view of national issues. And if we analyze what Stalin developed as a conception for Russia and later for Soviet Union, he was a pure pupil of the Austro-Marxist school on nationality question. What I want to tell you is that we must understand that Stalin was under very strong influence on German culture, and he was under the very strong influence of German left Marxist culture, and quite a lot of decisions taken by the Comintern were really influenced by German left, German culture, German communists. And Of course, things changed later after 1933 to a certain extent, but only to a certain extent, because as I told you, the German language was still then up to the very end, the official language of the Comintern, and that's very important. So that's why I would say that the Comintern policies toward the issue of fascism and later Hitlerism was to a very large extent linked with two basic facts. One is, of course, the Soviet state interests to preserve peace and collective security in the world, and especially in Europe. And of course, that was the Soviet state interest. And we understand that this point of view was very important within the Comintern because of Soviet state interest. But simultaneously, we see that the evolution of German communists had a very strong influence toward the decision of the Comintern. And as we know, German communists in the 20s were quite rationally then thinking that their main enemy are the Social Democrats because the Social Democrats killed them. That's an obvious fact. And that's why the theory of social fascism is not, an illusion that bursts among the heads of some completely disconnected from reality communist leaders, because this theory of social fascism was linked with the blood that was on the German city streets. And this has to be taken into account. The second thing is that, as I told you, the Italian fascism and to a certain extent the German Hitlerism could at the very beginning be analyzed as a lower class movement used by the imperialist German bourgeoisie, of course, but still a working class movement that is not really serious, and that will be taken earlier or later in such contradictions that some of them, at least, will go on the side of revolution, of course, of communist revolution. Of course, there was a misunderstanding of the force of the petit bourgeoisie, of the cultural petit bourgeoisie, and of the impoverished middle classes. And this, of course, we can now observe, but it was very difficult to think about that for the first time at the end of the 20s and beginning of the 30s. And this explains also the policy of Comintern, because the Comintern in Moscow didn't really take into account at the beginning that the Nazism is a so dangerous movement as it happened to be. As I told you, even social democrats, not only communists, but even social democrats when Hitler arrived to power, were convinced that Hitler cannot stay long in power and will not be able to create a totalitarian regime. And that's the reason why if communists concretely fought Nazis on the street of Germany, the Social Democrats didn't. most of the time, and they waited for the situation. The situation, of course, pushed them in concentration camps just as communists. But this has to be taken into account. And Comintern was not, an organization where Martians function, but was an organization where Soviet leaders influenced things, but in direct relations under the information coming to them from communist parties of the world. And as I told you, the German Marxism was so high in the cultural hegemony at that time that it was normal that the Comintern took the decisions that were more or less linked with the way Communist Party, German Communists, the German Communist Party was thinking about. So the evolution of Comintern is linked with the evolution of the German Communist Party, much more than the German Communist Party is linked with the evolution of the Comintern, I would say. But of course, I know that what I'm talking now about is something that looks very strange for people of anti-Stalinist ideology who are obsessed with the personality of Stalin. But also what I say can look strange for people who are, let's say, Stalinist minded, and who tend sometimes to look at Stalin not as one man among others, important man among others, but one man among others, but they look at him as a god. Stalin was not the devil the Trotskyists talk about, but Stalin was not the god some Stalinists are dreaming about, I would say. The reality is much more complicated, and the history of Comintern has to be rewrite to a large extent. Did I answer your question?
Yes, I am in communist movement more than 20 years, and always I was interested about the history of the communist movement. And these things about the German hegemony in the Comintern, it is first time. It is something it's surprising me. And your last sentence, that there are anti-Stalinists and there are Stalinists who think that maybe the Stalin was a god. Maybe I am not the person like this, but I am close for this. So for me, it is something. I always thought that the influence of Stalin for the communist movement was bigger than now you presented it. That in reality he was learning from Austrian and from Germans. But I have to think about it later.
I would say of Stalin, of course, whatever we think about him and whatever opinion we have, he was a very strong leader. He was a very intelligent man. And we have, of course, to accept that. But we have to think that an intelligent man, and even a genius, let's say, okay, he's a genius. He was at the head of an immense apparatus, and an intelligent leader is taking into account all elements working in the society. He is not, he cannot do what he wants. He must do what human conditions are giving him the possibility to do at a certain moment. And the second thing is that if you are very intelligent, you always learn from others. And Stalin was intelligent, that's for sure. And he was, and since he was intelligent, he knew that he had to read, and he read a lot. and we know that Stalin bibliothèque library is immense. Now we know that. But when you read a lot, you read what people write, and you take that into account. And of course, that the German Marxism was was the peak of Marxism from Marx Engels times up to the 20s, 30s. And we have to take that into account. And Stalin was, of course, aware of that. Stalin was a chief, was a leader, but Stalin was also a pupil. And he was a chief, a leader, because he was also a good pupil. And that we have to take into account. Stalin was very strong and very important, but it was not the center of the world. Yes, he was very strong because he knew he was not the center of the world. And you had a whole apparatus in Soviet Union that was pushing him to occupy that role. But he was always, if you look very realistically at the situation, you see that most of the time Stalin was the biggest adversary of the Stalin's cult. But the cult was coming from down up. It was a bottom up creation of, especially of the middle apparatus of the Soviet Party. But Stalin, I would say, Stalin was not so Stalinist as the Stalinists were.
Yes, but if I good understand your analysis, if we can say that the politic of the Comintern, which was in influence of the German communists and the destroying of German Communist Party of German in the time when Hitler take power, if we can say that all this strategy of social fascism, it was a fault of the Germans, and the changing of this strategy, it was because Stalin and people in the Soviet Union decided that no, we have to change this stupid policy.
Yeah, you're right. Just that I would not say it was a fault of German communists, because German communists are human beings. They are not machine. And, at that time, a lot of their comrades were killed by social fascists. And you cannot just say, oh, they should have understood that their main enemy is Hitler and not Ebert and Kautsky and Scheidemann and so on. Of course, the history teaches that. But in 1925, you lost your comrades 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and who killed them? And you have to take that into account, this human aspect, especially since nobody had the experience of a Hitler regime of that time. So it was very difficult to imagine that Hitler was a serious man. A bad man, but a serious man, and that he was going to control things much more efficiently than we could imagine at that time. So I would not say that it was a fault of German communists. It was, of course, objectively, historically speaking, it was a fault, but it was the first time. The first time you cannot know everything, what will happen. And of course, if you look at the Comintern, how the Comintern could know situation in Germany not taking into account the information coming through communists, through German communists, the analyses coming from German communists. So, of course, things changed when Hitler arrived to power, because then it appeared that the policy of the German communists failed. But it was very difficult to imagine earlier that it will be a failure. Soviet Union did understand what was Hitlerism, but it took times. And of course, the German communists did understand it a bit too late. But to a large extent, it's the fault of social democrats, because social democrats created the tools that made Hitler arrive to power. Without the Freikorps, you wouldn't have the SA, and without the SA, you wouldn't have the Nazi party in the power. So social fascism was a real threat. They accepted the creation of Freikorps. They preferred Freikorps than communists. So what?
So there is two questions from chat. I will read it together, this question, and I have also a lot of questions concerning this question of the class question which you presented, because if I could understand your analysis, it is very pessimistic for Europe in the time of desindustrialization.
To a certain extent, yes. Maybe I'm not so pessimistic as I looked, because I think that we have to take that that aspect into account.
Yes,
and it works. I mean, some Italian communists are working in that direction in a very efficient way. So we can win. But we have first to understand the real situation and not have illusion.
So firstly, I will read this question. So Safari Mukherjee, if Rosa Luxemburg and the revolution wasn't killed, how likely do you think that we would have a socialist Europe? And second question is Radio Anarchia. Just have finished to listen conversation with Bruno in Anti-Capitalist Radio, and I am wondering about one question. What Bruno think about Myśl Polska, Polish Mind as movement, and every week YouTube programs.
Every week what?
And the videos which they produced every week in the YouTube channel.
Yeah, okay. So first question, I'm a historian, and the first thing we learn, I mean, at least the first thing I learned when I began my course at Krakow University, I remember, is that a historian never asks question, what would happen if? Because if it didn't happen, it means that there are a lot of elements we don't know. But anyway, the if didn't succeed because of objective region, we have to take into account. So, of course, after this introduction, still I will answer to that question. But I think that basically the revolutionary in Germany. Just one moment, I have to. Okay, and basically, I think that I don't know if the social base of Spartakists in Germany, I mean Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, were sufficient to get to power. because, of course, and Rosa Luxemburg was quite aware about that, because if we look at her opinion when the Spartakists decided to launch this uprising, she was against, because she observed that the German society was not ready for revolution. So the question is, what could be done at that moment? But basically, we have to take into account that it doesn't please us, but it's a fact. German society was a society demoralized by war, by imperialist war, and a lot of the German working class was also to a large extent demoralized by this war and by all that imperialist mythology, because, you know, the collaboration of the Social Democrats with German imperialism at the beginning of the First World War didn't arrive from up a large part of Western European societies were ready to imperialism. Not only German, French, Italian, British, American societies, all were ready to imperialism. The only one who was not ready was Russian society, and the history showed that. So I don't really I cannot really imagine that the Spartakists by themselves were able to get to power by themselves, and what had to be done then, I don't know. It's a very difficult question to answer, but we can say that the decisions that were taken were not the good ones because they failed. But were there other solutions? I don't know. I don't really know about that. Concerning the second question, I have contact and I look from time to time to Miss Polska, but I have not regular. Most of the videos and articles of Miss Polska, I don't know. So I will not say more than I can. What I would say is that for sure it is a group of people who are intelligent. That's for sure. The second aspect I would say is that they are, from their point of view, quite open-minded. When I say open-minded, it means that they are capable to go outside their own point of views and to try to understand the situation within circles which have not their own opinions. And it's quite important, because one of the main errors a lot of leftists do now in Poland or in other countries is that they are not capable to understand other point of view, even enemy point of view. You must understand enemy point of view, even if you don't agree with that, but you have to do that. And on this point, I would say Miss Polska is interesting, since they can understand the way of thinking of their enemies, which can be our allies, but still of their enemies. And I would like left people to be open-minded and intelligent, as Miss Polski is sometimes. Miss Polska, excuse me, is sometimes. I would like to that, because it's one of the reasons quite a lot of friends or colleagues, let's say, I have in Poland, which are definitely left-oriented people, look at what is written in Myśl Polska because they don't find it in left-wing papers, and some of them even talk to me that, yes, I am thinking that maybe I will write an article for Myśl Polska because I couldn't write this article in left press, etc., etc. Concerning such issues as imperialism, American imperialism, militarism, colonialism, things who normally should be on the left agenda, or things concerning in Poland, Russia, where it is very almost impossible to have a rational analysis of what is, for example, Putin regime. Of course, Putin regime is not a leftist regime. It's obvious. But it doesn't mean that we have not to think about what is Putin and if Putin has a negative role everywhere or not. For example, for me, it's obvious that Russia has a very positive role in Syria, a very progressive role in Syria, because it's supporting a government which is rather left. Whatever we think about Assad, Assad is for sure one of the more left-oriented regime in the whole Arab world. Maybe it's not our left, but still it's left comparing to Egyptian regime, Saudi regime, Tunisian, Moroccan, and so on. So Russia is supporting Syria, and that's great. That's great. And Russia is supporting Venezuela. Russia is supporting Cuba. Russia is linked with China. Russia is supporting North Korea. We have to take that into account. Of course, Putin is on the bourgeois side. Of course, his policy in Russia is a reactionary policy. But still, we have to understand what is the class base of Putin and why Russia's policy from the leftist point of view is opportunistic, but not as negative as the policies of Western imperialists. The militaristic policy. I mean, Western powers, and especially United States, are warmongers. Putin's Russia is not warmongers. And where you find quite good analysis about that in Myśl Polska. You will not have that in Krytyka, Krytyka Społeczna, or you don't find that in most of so-called left Polish medias. It's very sad, but that's the fact. Concerning Belarus, for example, Myśl Polska has a much more rational way of analyzing social reality of Belarus than a lot of Polish so-called left. The problem of the left in the Western world is that the moral left took the control of the left and eliminated or marginalized class left. Since we have no class left organized, not a lot of them, or at least, sometimes I can understand that some intellectuals tell we are in a situation when the world is on the is in a very dangerous situation, because we must understand that we are in a situation which is quite comparable with the situation before the First World War, with the difference that we have atom bombs. So it's much more dangerous now than it was in 1940. And a lot of people in the left don't understand that the warmongers are the United States and their allies, of course, and they are pushing the world toward catastrophe. And in this situation, who, for example, in Poland, are rationally analyzing this situation and understanding that we are on the verge of a world war. We have to understand that. We are on the verge of a world war. And if we have no war up to now, it's because of China and Russia and Iran. Mostly these three countries. Out of these three countries, only one is socialist. But still, that's the three rationally analyzing world situation and defending more or less peace, even if their policy can be criticized here and there, social policies or even foreign policies here and there, but still they are defending peace for objective reason, not for moral reason. Putin is not a good guy, but he's at the head of a state which is rather weak and needs to develop its industry and to have a national economy and so on and so on. And because of this reason, that are the reason why he's supported by some people from the bourgeoisie, from the Russian bourgeoisie, not from the proletariat, from the bourgeoisie. Still, it is rather a positive a positive situation. And of course, it's very difficult in Poland to speak about that, because in Poland there is a, let's say, traditional Russophobia, which is completely irrational. Completely irrational. It has nothing to do with a rational analysis of the, let's say, negative aspects of the Russian society and of the Russian system. It is completely irrational, and it has to be considered like that. And Miss Polska, when Miss Polska is writing article about Russia, we can agree or not with this or that in this article, but they are purely rationalistic articles. They analyze, think rationally, not emotionally, as we are doing in liberal circles, in other nationalist circles, or in a lot of, let's say, moral left circles. And that's the reason why my way of thinking about Miss Polska is balanced. And you know, when they ask me in Miss Polska to talk to them, I do, because I know that a lot of people reading Miss Polska are left-oriented people who do not find their place in the left medias, let's say. Miss Polska concerning Russia is much better than Tribuna. Miss Polska concerning a lot of wars in Syria, in Yemen, in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Libya is much more progressive than Tribuna or a lot of so-called left medias. Even concerning Solidarność, the history of Solidarność, the left doesn't want to really analyze that. It's difficult to criticize Solidarność and the strikes in 1980 and so on. In Miss Polska, they have no complex about that. They think about that. But as I told you, I don't really know all articles and all videos they are doing. So my opinion is linked with what I observed about them, and not about all what you can find. I had no time actually to make a study of what is Miss Polska.
I would like to add that all these leftist media, which you said, It is the media, I can say, social democratic
Yeah, of
media.
course.
And of course, this social democratic media in Poland, they promote the point of view, the imperialism, NATO imperialism.
Mhm.
So is this in this level the analysis of Belarus is better in Myśl Polska than this social
Yeah,
democratic, but also we have a little, very little media, I can say ultra leftist media,
yeah. Now you're right.
and this ultra leftist media analysis of the situation in Belarus is also stupid when they I don't know, writing articles about that we have that we have Russian imperialism, and we, the communists, Polish communists, we have to firstly be against the bourgeoisie of Russia and the Putin, because so they can wrote articles using the Marxist terminology, but and it is very you have impression that you are reading very good stuff because there are the citation from Marx, from Lenin, from the, but the when you
Right.
finish article you understand yes, but it is also NATO propaganda.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right.
uh, okay, so now this is I would like to ask you about this class analysis, because in this you said that that Hitler that the industrial workers didn't supported Hitler, they
Mhm.
supported social democracy or communism, but he was supported by the little shopkeepers and the people like this. And now in the modern capitalist system, especially now in the time of the epidemic, we have this situation of the expansion of the big corporation like Walmart, like Amazon, which provoke the proletarization of these shopkeepers. That
Yeah.
many of them are go out from the market because the big corporation take all. They totally
Mm.
destroyed the small enterprises, small
Yeah, yeah.
and and uh, uh, and and who they became? They
Ah,
became we they can become proletariat, or they can become I don't know. They can work in Uber, and
that's
as you
right. Yeah.
say that it is mm, the petit bourgeois mentality, or they can become proletariat for very in the precarious salaries,
Precarious.
precarious conditions, and in your opinion, this trend, which is now in economy, that these small classes are dying because of the multinational, from you think that they will go towards fascism, like in 1930s, or it will provoke the this class struggle, which was we can find in the manifest of the
Yeah.
party communist, that
Yes, yes.
it is something that okay, you understand question.
Yeah, I understand. First of all, the new fascism we have now to deal with is not exactly the copy of the fascism of the 30s, because, bourgeoisie is intelligent. They will not recreate a Nazi party in Germany or in any other country, because they know that nobody would go behind, or not a lot of people, not enough people would go behind. So they have now a new form of fascism, which is more, let's say, friendly, quote. and looks a little bit more colorful and more friendly, and which can even accept the difference of so-called races on another ground. But basically, of course, it's always fascism, but not exactly the same brand of fascism. What will happen, of course, I cannot know, but I would say that the proletarization is an objective movement. The question is that this proletarization is happening in a completely different situation where the left is disorganized, not only on organization way, but also on ideological way. So we have to be very aware that we have to reconquer the minds of people in a society where even workers are now to a large extent under the cultural hegemony of their class enemy. That's first thing. But we have some example, I would say 3 examples we can take into account, which are showing us that if we are on the ground, then we can have some success. 2 of these examples are in Europe, and 1 is in India. I would say first, Graz, you say the city of Graz in Austria, as you know, has a communist mayor now. Austria is a society with no strong left-wing roots. Austria is a Western European society where all the trends you talked about are the same. But when you have a grassroots movement, and the communists of Graz are grassroots movement because they were even in the opposition toward the National Austrian Communist Party, because the local structure of the Communist Party were much more militant than the whole Communist Party all over Austria. And it's not, it's not by chance that they get power in Graz. It's because they worked for already 20 years, day by day, in their suburbs, in their city districts, in factories, and so on. So they managed to create a proletarian, let's say, way of thinking in a society which is the same as everywhere in Europe, which is a society which is fragmented, which is under the cultural hegemony of petit bourgeois ideals, and so on and so on. So the example of Graz is showing us that we can change the tide. The second example is the Italian one, where you have the destruction of the communist movement, as you know, but out from the let's say armed struggle, the Italian armed struggle in the 70s. Appeared one organization, which is an organization, which is a network actually, which is Rete di Comunisti. It means the communist network, which prepared from the 70s up to now something like a cultural revolution in Italy, step by step. And of course, it was not really observed by the mainstream medias, and that's very interesting. And they managed to create what they did manage to create. Their first goal was to create a trade union, and they managed to create this trade union. Now they have the USB, which has more or less in Italy 300,000 members. It's quite important. And what is very important is that they managed not only to conquer bases among the, let's say, industrial working class, but they managed to create unions among petit bourgeois, among precariat, among young migrants, among people where all over Europe we left cannot manage to organize them. And they did it in Italy. And they launched quite a lot of strike, which are working now. I don't say that that tomorrow there will be a revolution in Italy, but at least they created a 300,000 trade union. They recruited quite a lot of isolated people. And they created a proletarian culture among people who were very far from proletariat. And so that's the second example that shows that if we are on the ground, we can create something, but we have to be on the ground. And to be on the ground, it means to be every day in a certain district of the city, or in a certain factory, or in front of certain important institution, like unemployed institution and so on. And if we do the job, then it works. It takes time. For the Austrian and for the Italian, it took 20 years or even more. But it did. They happened. And that the third example I will give is a very good example, far from us, but still, it's in India. You know that last year we had the largest strike in the human history, because we had 250 million striking workers all over India. 250 million workers. Of course, India is a huge country. Of course, there are millions and hundreds of millions of people in India, but still, the largest strike in the human history is something we didn't experience at the time of the Russian Revolution, at the time of the Chinese Revolution, and we did experience it last year, so it's important to take into account. And what is important to take into account, that of course, it's quite difficult to organize a strike in a country where you have officially, I think, 14 official languages. So for communication problems are difficult in that country, but if in spite of that, they managed to organize this strike. And what is very important is that they managed to organize this strike not only among centralized, let's say, industrial workers, which of course they did, but the biggest success of this strike is that in India you have a strong textile industry, but in the 70s, this industry was based, as everywhere in the world, was based on factories. And workers of these factories were a little bit, let's say, too revolutionary, according to the bourgeoisie. So they destroyed these factories and they decided that the work has to be done, but will be done by a woman in different villages. In villages, you have one woman, she works for the factory. In another villages, another woman working for that factory, and so on and so on. And the factory has now a very few workers, because most of the workers are outside factories. And of course, it's the same thing they did in Italy in the 70s. They fragmented the working class, so not to have in front of them a united working class with a class consciousness, with a proletarian consciousness. And what did the Indian communist trade union in India is to go from one village to another village, from one village to another village, day by day, year by year, convincing these women that they are not alone. That, of course, they are alone in one village, but on the next village you have another one. And on the next village you have another one. And so on and so on. And all that makes a huge amount of people that can fight. And they organized them. And at the very end, it gave this 200 million striking people. So it's possible, out of Uberized people, to make them class conscious. But of course, we have to work for that. We have to have a left movement, which is not a theory, which is practical. I mean, two weeks ago, I was, in Paris. I'm in the southern suburb of Paris, but very near Paris. And I had a friend which is living in the 15th district of Paris, which is very near from me. And he called me and he told, I call you because the workers of the fabrics, the garbage treatment of Paris are on strike. And of course, they are quite alone. And we are trying to go to help them. So, of course, I went there. And I had discussion with the striking peoples. They are most of them are illiterate. They are coming from Mali, from Senegal. They don't know how to write and read, and they were for 2 years fighting to have the same pay as they had earlier, because now their masters are not from the same enterprise, so their situation is worse than it was earlier. So they of course protested for 2 years, but they were quite alone. And at the very end, it means 2 years ago, the local branch of the CGT, the district, began to help them to have something like a class consciousness and so on and so on. And it took more or less 2 years of work to make them aware that they are in a very bad situation, but that they have a very strategical importance, because they treat the garbage of Paris. And of course, you have to. It's something very central. But they couldn't realize that they are. What is their place for the national French economy? Because, as I told you, they are illiterate, and they were taken by the Veolia, in this case is Veolia enterprise, because they are illiterate. Because if they are illiterate, it means that they will not be able to understand their class situation. So you see that the bourgeoisie is very aware they need fragmented workers and they need uneducated workers. But still, concretely, they managed to be organized. And of course, as soon as I went there, I called friends of other unions in other parts of Paris, and I talk about that, and I say we have to help them, and we have to write articles about that, and we have to make the information, because Parisian people must know that they pay tax to have a decent garbage system, but their tax are used to make people richer, to make the owners richer and richer, and not pay the workers, and so on and so on. And we have to organize that. But of course, we have to organize that on the ground, not in coffee shops, not in internet. We have to go where people are isolated, fragmented, exploited, and where they feel isolated. If we do that, of course, revolution will not be tomorrow. As I told you, the Italian and the Austrian, it took them 20 years. So we have to think in terms of 20 years. Maybe it will happen earlier, as the Yellow Vest did happen suddenly without being planned. So maybe something will happen before. But we have to have the idea that even if it takes 20 years, we have to do that. To be every day in in the streets, in the district, in the same district. You must work with people, and with people have to know you, and you have to explain them, and they have to understand that their situation is not the same as millions of other people's, and that they are strong, they're not weak, and if they are illiterate, it doesn't matter because they can learn. They can. There are a lot of means to teach them, even if they cannot read and write. At least they can hear. They can have videos. They can have a conference. They can have debate. We can help them, but we have to be we have to accept to be with people. And the problem of the left now in Europe is that it's quite a lot of them are intellectuals, or I think that if they are working in internet, it's not bad. The internet is very good. The best proof is that we are doing it now, but it's not enough. I mean, we have to be with people on a daily basis, and that's the way we have to do it. Because contrary to the 30s, at least people know now, in most countries, maybe it's not the case in Poland, but it's the case in France. I mean, in France, 75% of the people, according to polls, think capitalism is bad and has to be changed for another system. They don't really know what has to be changed and how it has to be. But 75% of people, so including people voting for right-wing parties, understand capitalism is a bad system. In United States, 55% of the youth between 18 and 25 think socialism is a good idea. Of course, for them, it's just an idea. But still, I mean, the situation in the 30s was much worse, because people thinking that socialism was a good idea were in minority in United States. In France, the majority of people were thinking up to 20 years ago that capitalism was a good system, that it has only to be changed in a, let's say, Keynesian way, and everything will be fine. Now they understand capitalism is a bad system. So we have a rather good situation, but we have to be to have the energy to take this situation as a situation that pushes us to be active on daily basis. That's what I think about that.
Yes,
So Austrian, Graz, Italian, and Indian example are 3 examples to study.
I think that there are other examples.
Yeah, of course.
Also, can give out the a little positive energy. I would like to ask you, if you have a time, one more question. It is concerning this word social fascism. That in the Polish situation, what should we do in the time when the Polish social democracy, they support all the color revolution in the world, and they supported the fascists in Ukraine, the people in Belarus also in there are latest fascism. They spread the anti-communist propaganda toward China, toward Venezuela, toward Cuba, and so they attack the socialism. Very often they promote openly fascist movements. And but sometimes in Poland there are the things that we are against something, and social democrats also they are against the same thing. So for you, you think that the using these words is better to forget, to not make enemy with the social democrats, or we have to continue? And
we have to continue, but we can use one word which is quite clear: is social imperialism. because they are actually, this moral left is really social imperialistic. What they want basically is that imperialism will work and give them some money plundered in third world or in third world countries. Of course, it's not conscious for them, but basically, they want imperialists to grab the more they can and to give to the so-called working people, average people, some of this plundered money. So it's objectively social imperialism. There are for a socialized, for them socialized imperialism, but they are imperialists basically. So we can say social imperialists or social militarists, because they are supporting militarism, in fact. Because when we are talking against Russia, against China, against Iran, of course, I understand these countries and this political system can be criticized. The problem is not that. But the basic problem is that 3/4 of military investment in the world are United States and their allies. So whatever we think about Putin, about Iran, about China, about whatever you want, these countries are not a threat to world peace, because they cannot be a threat to world peace. Even if we think that every morning the obsession of Putin is to push his troops in Warsaw, which is of course stupid, but okay, let's think Putin's obsession is that every morning when he's eating his breakfast, he's thinking, oh, it would be good if my Russian troop would be in Poland. Okay, let's say. But he's not able to do that, because the Russian militarist institutions are much more too weak to do that. Of course, he can rivalize with United States on atom bomb. That's for sure. And that's one reason we have still peace. But basically speaking, his army is not able to invade any country in the world, when the United States, they have more or less 1,000 military bases outside their territory. Russia has 15 bases out of their territory, and China 1 base outside its territory. The United States, they have more or less a little bit less than 1,000 bases, and I don't take into account client states like Saudi Arabia, like Israel, like France, like England, like Japan, etc., whose armies
Like Poland.
are linked with American army, NATO, Quad, and so on and so on. So 3/4 of the military investment in the world are Western-based, US-based investment, and that's that's a fact. That's an objective fact. It's not an illusion. It's an objective fact. So I mean, if all non-belonging to the Western alliance countries of the world would unite, all countries, it means countries very different, like Iran, Russia, Cuba, Pakistan, Malaysia, and so on and so on. If all those countries would unite, which is completely theoretical, they would represent less than 1/4 of the military investments. So what you have to talk about? I mean, there is no problem. Just show statistics. We are not in the situation on that ground. We are not in the situation of the two world wars, because in the situation of the two world wars, you had two more or less balanced power. Germany and the Western powers were more or less balanced. Now we have no balance. I mean, we have no balance at all. The warmongers are only in the West. Even if Putin is dreaming that he could be a warmonger, let's accept this hypothesis. I doubt, but let's accept that Putin is dreaming he will be a warmonger. He's not able to be a warmonger by now. And that's the most important, because, I mean, if we are scientific, if we are Marxist, we look at facts, not as feelings. So what Putin is feeling, I don't care about. I just care about what he is doing. I mean, Hitler was a very bad man, but because why? Not because of his feelings, but because Germany was a military power with a military industry, with a big bourgeoisie. I think that there are a lot of Hitler in the world. But, you know, if you arrive at the head of Bhutan or Nepal, even if you are a Hitler, what can you do? You cannot do nothing, because, of course, Nepal military power is nothing. So you're not a danger. You're a danger when your military power is a real power. And apart from atomic power, Russia is not a military power. I mean, Russian army is not a strong army. Comparing, of course, it's a strong army, absolutely. But comparing with Western armies, it's nothing.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. So when cameras now will use the word social fascist, I will tell them that it was actual in 20th century. Now Bruno changed the definition. Now social imperialist.
So social militaristic or social imperialistic, yes. Up to you.
Okay, so I will finish